Commander Ethan Davis stepped off the transport shuttle onto Ziggurar 7's alien soil, the unfamiliar terrain stark beneath the brilliant orange sky. A diverse blend of species filled the port, their languages an intricate weave of alien tongues. Ziggurar 7 was famous as a hub of intergalactic trade, and to some, a notorious world where anything could happen, depending on your luck or your skills. Ethan's pulse quickened as he adjusted his gear. This was his first time on this planet, and he had come on a mission to broker peace between two warring factions. His mission was clear, but the atmosphere was anything but comforting. Everything about the place screamed danger. His steps quickened as he navigated through the bustling marketplace. Suddenly, a figure stepped into his path. A tall, slender woman with skin the shade of lavender and eyes that seemed to glimmer with gold flecks. She stood out even among the mix of aliens surrounding them. Her movements were smooth, predatory even, as she closed the distance between them. Ethan Davis, right? Her voice was melodic, though there was an undertone that made his spine stiffen. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "The galaxy whispers when someone like you arrives," she said with a soft smile, her fingers brushing lightly against the insignia on his chest. "Humans are rare here, especially one as interesting as you." Ethan frowned, taking a step back. He wasn't in the mood for games. "And you are?" "I'm Zaria," she said, her smile growing wider. "And I have a proposition for you." Ethan glanced around at the many eyes already staring in their direction. He wasn't sure if it was his human status or Zaria's presence that drew so much attention, but the last thing he needed was to become a spectacle. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." Her laugh was light, as if his response amused her. "Oh, I'm not selling anything. But I am curious," she said, stepping closer, her gaze locking onto his with a sudden intensity. "Tell me, Commander, is it true the humans are compatible with any species in the galaxy?" Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "What?" "I've heard stories," she continued, unperturbed by his shock, "that humans have a certain adaptability, that you can mate with any species, no matter how biologically different. I want to know, can you do it with me?" He stared at her, dumbfounded. This was not the kind of question he had expected to be asked within his first hour on the planet. "That's not," Ethan began, trying to form a coherent response. "I'm not here for that. I'm here on a diplomatic mission." Zaria tilted her head, her golden eyes gleaming with something that might have been amusement. "Diplomatic missions, mating rituals, on Ziggurar 7. Everything is a negotiation. You never know where alliances can form." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested in playing games." "Oh, but Commander," she said softly, her voice dipping lower, "this isn't a game. And whether you like it or not, you've already started playing." Before he could respond, she turned on her heel, glancing over her shoulder. "Come find me when you change your mind." As Zaria disappeared into the crowd, Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had come here to prevent a war, but somehow it felt like he was about to walk into a far more personal conflict, one he wasn't prepared for. Hours later, Ethan found himself in the Central Council chambers, surrounded by the leaders of both factions he was sent to negotiate with. The tension in the room was thick, each side barely able to look at the other without seething in anger. He had read reports on the conflict, a feud that had lasted generations, but none of the data had prepared him for the sheer animosity that radiated from both sides. Commander Davis, the delegate from the Eloxian Empire, said, a tall, multi-limbed creature with eyes that seemed to bore through him. "We are here because your people promised an impartial mediator. However, we have heard concerning things." Ethan straightened his posture, his instincts telling him this was going to be far more difficult than anticipated. "I'm here to ensure that both sides come to a peaceful resolution. Whatever rumors you've heard, my personal affairs have no bearing on this mission." "Yet you were seen in the company of Zaria," the delegate continued, his tone sharp. "She is known for influencing decisions in ways that defy protocol. I've had no dealings with her beyond a brief conversation, Ethan replied firmly. My focus is solely on this negotiation. The tension in the room grew as murmurs circulated among the delegates. Ethan could sense the distrust. He needed to steer the conversation back on track. This conflict has already cost both your people too much. It's time to end it before more lives are lost. A low, grumbling sound came from one of the Krallian delegates, a massive reptilian being whose bared teeth glinted menacingly. And why should we listen to you, human? You are but a stranger here. Ethan held his ground, his gaze unwavering. I'm here to bring a fresh perspective. If you can't settle this now, then what future do your people have? The council fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. But before anyone could respond, the doors to the chamber swung open, and there stood Zaria, her eyes fixed on Ethan. This is far from over, Commander, she said, her voice like a warning and a promise rolled into one. Ethan's eyes locked with Zaria's for a moment, the tension in the room thickening as her presence cast a long shadow over the negotiations. The murmurs among the delegates grew louder, and the distrust became palpable. The Krallian delegate let out a hiss, his reptilian eyes narrowing at the sight of the alien woman. What is she doing here? The Eloxian delegate demanded, his multi-limbed frame bristling with agitation. This is a closed council session. Zaria ignored the protests, her graceful yet determined steps carrying her toward Ethan. Her eyes never wavered from his, filled with an intensity that unnerved even the most hardened diplomats in the room. As she approached, Ethan could feel the weight of her presence, as though she carried the entire galaxy's expectations on her shoulders. I came to remind everyone, Zaria spoke slowly, her voice calm yet commanding, that this conflict cannot be solved by mere words. Not when both sides cling so desperately to hatred and vengeance. The Krallian delegate slammed his clawed fist onto the table, rattling the objects around him. Who are you to speak of our pain? This is not your war, Zaria. She turned to him, her expression softening just slightly. No, it is not my war. But I've seen the destruction it has wrought on both your worlds. And if it continues, neither side will survive. The Eloxian delegate scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. We've heard this rhetoric before. Peace talks have been attempted countless times, and every time, they failed. Why should this time be any different? Zaria's gaze flickered back to Ethan, her voice taking on a more measured tone. Because this time, there's something greater at stake, a threat neither of you have considered. Ethan raised an eyebrow, sensing where she was headed but unsure of her full intentions. What threat? He asked cautiously. Zaria stepped forward, turning her attention to the entire council. There's a force far beyond your petty squabbles. A force watching, waiting for both your civilizations to weaken themselves so it can strike. If you continue down this path of self-destruction, neither of your people will have a future. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the Krallian delegate seemed taken aback, his menacing expression faltering for the first time. Ethan seized the opportunity. Zaria is right. This conflict isn't just about your people anymore. If you don't come to an agreement soon, there won't be anything left to fight over. The Eloxian delegate sneered, though his voice was quieter now. And what force is this, Commander? Do you believe in the stories this alien woman tells? Ethan hesitated, glancing at Zaria. He didn't have proof of the threat she spoke of, but deep down, he trusted her judgment. Her presence here wasn't just a coincidence, it was a warning. Zaria met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Commander Davis has seen it too, she said softly. The signs are there. The outer sectors of both your territories have reported unusual disturbances, have they not? The Krallian delegate grunted in acknowledgement, though his distrust remained. Strange anomalies, unexplained disappearances. The Eloxian delegate stiffened. Those are rumors, nothing more. Zaria shook her head. They are not rumors. They are the first steps of an invasion. one that won't stop at your borders. It will consume your worlds, your people, and everything you fought to protect." The room remained eerily quiet. The weight of Zaria's words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the fragility of their situation. Ethan took a deep breath, stepping forward. "You don't have to believe us, but you can't afford to ignore the possibility. If you continue this war, you'll weaken yourselves to the point where you'll be powerless against this greater threat." The Eloxian delegate's eyes narrowed, his skepticism fading as he considered the possibility. "And what would you have us do, human? Surrender to our enemies?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm not asking you to surrender. I'm asking you to unite, to find common ground, if only for the survival of your species." The Krallian delegate let out a low growl, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Zaria. "A temporary alliance to deal with this threat. And after?" Zaria's voice was steady. "After, you'll decide the future of your people. But if you don't work together now, there won't be an after." For a moment, the council chamber was silent, each delegate lost in their thoughts. Ethan could feel the tension shifting, the possibility of peace inching closer. Finally, the Eloxian delegate spoke, his voice low but firm. "We will consider your words, Commander. But know this, if you are deceiving us, the consequences will be dire." Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm not here to deceive anyone. I'm here to stop more bloodshed." The Krallian delegate stood, his massive frame towering over the others. "We will discuss this proposal with our leaders, but do not think this means we trust you, human." With that, the delegates began to leave the chamber, one by one. The tension remained, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. As the doors closed behind them, Zaria approached Ethan, her voice low. "This is only the beginning, Commander. The real challenge lies ahead." Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I know, but it's a start." Zaria's gaze softened, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've done well today, but you'll need more than words to survive what's coming." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't do this alone. And as he looked at Zaria, he realized that she might be the key to unlocking the future they all desperately needed. "Then let's get to work," he said, determination fueling his every word. Zaria nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of challenge and hope. "Agreed." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The Krallians and Eloxians had retreated to their respective quarters, where they were undoubtedly debating their next steps. Ethan knew the battle wasn't won yet. Both sides were entrenched in hatred that ran so deep it had shaped their cultures for generations. But a small crack had appeared in their armor, and now it was up to him and Zaria to widen that crack before the upcoming threat could strike. In the meantime, Ethan pored over the reports Zaria had mentioned, combing through intelligence on the disturbances along the border regions of both factions. The anomalies were irregular but not insignificant: disappearing outposts, strange energy signatures, and most chilling of all, communications that had gone dark with no explanation. They pointed to something vast and powerful, but there were no clear answers. Ethan was in his quarters, the dim lighting casting long shadows over the room, when a soft chime at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called, his voice steady despite the heavy weight on his mind. The door slid open to reveal Zaria, her posture relaxed yet purposeful. Her silver eyes reflected the low light, creating an almost ethereal glow around her. She stepped inside, her presence filling the small space. "You've been quiet," she noted, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just trying to make sense of all this. If what you say is true, we're running out of time." Zaria crossed the room, taking the seat across from him. "It is true, Commander. The question is whether we can convince the Krallians and Eloxians to see it before it's too late." Ethan met her gaze, the frustration clear in his expression. They're both so caught up in their hatred that I'm not sure they'll ever see reason. Even now, they're only considering an alliance out of fear." Zeria smiled faintly, the corners of her lips barely lifting. "Fear can be a powerful motivator. It's not ideal, but it's a start. And they're listening to you, which is more than I expected." He let out a bitter laugh. "Listening to me because they think I'm some impartial outsider. But that's not really true, is it? I'm here on orders, just like they are." Zeria's gaze softened. "Orders or not, you've shown them a path they couldn't see for themselves. That's more than most could do in your position." Ethan nodded, though the weight of doubt still pressed against his mind. "And what about you? Why are you helping me? You could have let me flounder in that chamber today, but you didn't." Her expression became more guarded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not helping you, Ethan. I'm helping all of us. This threat isn't something I can fight alone." He studied her face, sensing there was more beneath her words than she was letting on. "What are you really after, Zeria? Why are you so invested in stopping this war?" For a moment, she remained silent, her gaze distant as though lost in thought. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something personal. "I've seen what war can do, Ethan. To people, to planets, to entire civilizations. My world was lost to a conflict we never saw coming. I won't let that happen again." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. "Your world?" Zeria's jaw tightened, her voice becoming almost a whisper. "It's gone now. Destroyed by forces that cared nothing for our lives. We were just collateral damage." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had always known Zeria was different. Her presence, her confidence, but he hadn't expected this. "I'm sorry," he said softly, unsure of what else to offer. She shook her head. "Don't be. It happened a long time ago. But I learned something important. Those who cling to old grudges and hatred lose everything. And the galaxy moves on without them." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle into the room like a heavy fog. It wasn't just about stopping the war for her. It was about preventing another tragedy from repeating itself. Her mission wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. "Well, we're not going to let that happen here," he said with determination. "Not if we can help it." Zeria's silver eyes flickered with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "It won't be easy. The leaders of both sides still believe they can win this war if they just push hard enough. And their people will follow them into the abyss if they're not stopped." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll have to change the way they see this conflict. Show them that the real enemy isn't each other." Zeria stood, her posture shifting to one of quiet strength. "There's another option," she said carefully, her voice low. "A way to force their hand." Ethan frowned. "What are you suggesting?" She met his gaze, the intensity in her eyes sending a chill down his spine. "I have contacts. People who can help us make this threat more visible. If we can show the Kralians and Eloxians that the enemy is already at their doorstep, they'll have no choice but to act." Ethan stood as well, crossing the room to face her. "Are you talking about a setup? Manufacturing evidence to scare them into action?" Zeria shook her head, her expression deadly serious. "No, the evidence is real. The threat is real. But we can bring it into the light sooner than they expect. It's risky, but it might be the only way to break through their stubbornness." Ethan fought for a moment, his mind racing. It was a dangerous idea, but then again, everything about this mission had been dangerous from the start. "And you trust these contacts of yours?" Zeria's lips curled into a small smile. "I trust them as much as I trust anyone in this galaxy. Which, I suppose, is to say not much. But they'll get the job done." Ethan took a deep breath, weighing his options. It wasn't the most orthodox approach, but time was running out, and he had seen enough in his years as a soldier to know that sometimes the rules had to bend. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." Zeria nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Then we'll start immediately. The sooner we expose the truth, the better." As she turned to leave, Ethan called after her, his voice more serious than before. "Zaria, if this goes wrong, if we don't succeed, what happens then?" She paused at the door, her back to him, her voice soft but resolute. "Then we fight, and we keep fighting until there's nothing left." With that, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of their next move. The path ahead was dangerous, but he knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. The mission had truly begun. The plan moved quickly after that. Zaria's contacts were as resourceful as she promised, operating in the shadows of the galaxy, outside the watchful eyes of the major factions. They were a mix of smugglers, mercenaries, and former soldiers, each with their own reasons for staying off the radar. Ethan was cautious, but he knew they had little choice. If they were going to force the Krallians and Eloxians into action, they needed to expose the true threat before it was too late. 3 days later, Ethan and Zaria stood aboard a transport ship bound for a sector near the contested border. The plan was to rendezvous with one of Zaria's contacts who had vital information about the alien menace that had been lurking at the edge of both factions' territories. If they could gather solid proof of the threat, it would be enough to push the Krallians and Eloxians into cooperation. At least, that was the hope. Ethan stared out the viewport, watching the stars streak by as the ship moved through the void. His mind raced with 100 thoughts: whether they were doing the right thing, whether Zaria's contacts could be trusted, whether the Krallians and Eloxians could put aside their hatred long enough to work together. Beside him, Zaria stood in silence, her eyes fixed on the same distant stars. She had been more guarded since their last conversation, her usual confidence tempered by something else, something darker. Ethan wasn't sure if it was fear or resolve, but either way, he knew she carried the weight of this mission as heavily as he did. "You've been quiet," Ethan said after a long stretch of silence. "Nervous?" Zaria glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Nervous? No, just thinking. This plan of ours, it's risky." "You've said that before," Ethan replied. "But you've never been the type to shy away from a challenge." Zaria shrugged, her expression unreadable. "That doesn't mean I'm not aware of the stakes. This could go wrong in so many ways." Ethan nodded. "And if it does," she sighed, folding her arms across her chest, "then we'll adapt as always. But I don't like relying on other people to make or break a mission, especially people like the ones we're meeting." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't trust them." "I trust them to do what's in their best interest," Zaria said. "But their interests aren't always aligned with ours. We need to be careful." He appreciated her honesty, though it didn't exactly put him at ease. "We'll be careful," he agreed, his tone firm. "We can't afford to make any mistakes." The ship's internal comms crackled to life, and the pilot's voice echoed through the cabin. "Commander, we're approaching the rendezvous point. Prepare for docking." Ethan straightened, checking his sidearm as a precaution. They weren't expecting trouble, but out here, in the borderlands, anything could happen. Zaria did the same, her movements fluid and practiced. Within minutes, the ship docked with a larger freighter floating in the void. The vessel was old, its hull scarred by years of hard service, but it was still operational. As they disembarked and made their way into the freighter's interior, they were greeted by a trio of figures standing in the dimly lit cargo bay. The leader stepped forward, a tall, wiry human with a patch over one eye and a scar running down the side of his face. He extended a hand toward Ethan, a grin spreading across his face. "Commander Davis, I presume. I'm Cade. Zaria's told me a lot about you." Ethan shook the man's hand, his grip firm but cautious. "Let's hope it was all good." Cade chuckled. "Mostly. Though she did warn me you might be a bit by the book." Zaria smirked, stepping forward to join the conversation. "Cade, cut the banter. Do you have what we came for?" Cade's grin faded, and he gestured for them to follow. "Right down to business. I like that. Come on, I'll show you what we've got." They walked through the narrow corridors of the freighter until they reached a small operations room, where a series of holographic displays flickered with images and data. Cade activated one of the displays, bringing up a map of the contested region between the Kralians and Eloxians. Red markers dotted the map, indicating the locations of the anomalies Ethan had been investigating. "This is the intel we've gathered over the last few months," Cade explained. "Strange energy readings, missing ships, destroyed outposts. We've tracked the patterns, and it all points to one thing. Someone, or something, is testing the borders." Ethan studied the map closely, his heart sinking as he recognized the scale of the problem. "And you're sure this isn't just a rogue faction or pirates?" Cade shook his head. "No way. The energy signatures alone are beyond anything pirates could get their hands on. This is military-grade tech, and it's not Kralian or Eloxian. It's something else. Something bigger." Zaria leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she processed the data. "What about their fleet movements? Have you been able to track where they're coming from?" Cade hesitated for a moment before bringing up another display. "That's the thing. Whoever they are, they're good at staying hidden. We've only caught glimpses of their ships, and every time we get close, they disappear. But we think they're building up for something big." Ethan's stomach churned as he realized what this meant. The Kralians and Eloxians were so focused on fighting each other that they had no idea a far greater threat was looming just beyond their borders. And if Cade was right, they didn't have much time before that threat made its move. "So what do we do with this?" Ethan asked, turning to Zaria. She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the holographic display as she considered their options. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "We bring it to the council," she said, her voice resolute, "and we make them understand that if they don't put aside their differences, they're both going to be wiped out." Ethan nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. The Kralians and Eloxians were stubborn, proud, and deeply mistrustful of one another. Convincing them to work together was going to be the hardest part of this entire mission. But if they didn't succeed, the consequences would be catastrophic. "We'll need more than just data," Zaria added, her tone steely. "We need to show them something they can't ignore, something undeniable." Cade smirked, clearly enjoying the challenge. "Oh, don't worry. We've got a few surprises in store for them." Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path ahead was filled with danger. But there was no turning back now. The war they were trying to prevent was already at their doorstep. The journey back to the council was tense. The atmosphere on the ship felt heavier as Ethan, Zaria, and their new ally Cade prepared to present their findings to both the Kralians and Eloxians. They knew the data would be explosive, potentially enough to push both factions into cooperation, but just as easily, it could spark more violence if handled incorrectly. As the ship approached the neutral planet where the council meetings were held, Ethan went over their plan again in his mind. They would present the irrefutable evidence of the alien menace building on the borders, the strange energy readings, the destroyed outposts, everything that Cade's network had gathered. But more than that, they would have to prove that the threat was imminent, that both the Kralians and Eloxians would be annihilated if they didn't act together. Ethan glanced at Zaria, who was sitting across from him, her eyes closed as she meditated in silence. He admired her ability to find calm in moments like these. She was unreadable, a mask of composure hiding whatever fears or doubts she might have been harboring. He wished he could feel the same. "Cade," Ethan said, turning to the man standing beside the cockpit, "you sure your contacts won't double-cross us? If word gets out before we make the presentation, this could blow up in our faces." Cade crossed his arms, his usual grin replaced by a more serious expression. "My contacts know what's at stake. This isn't just about money or politics anymore. We're talking survival, Commander. If this threat wipes out the Kralians and Eloxians, you can bet they'll come for the rest of us next." Ethan nodded. It was a small reassurance, but it was better than nothing. They had no choice but to trust Cade's network for now. As the ship touched down on the Council's landing platform, Ethan's mind snapped back to the task ahead. The neutral city surrounding them was a hub of politics and intrigue, with towering spires and grand halls where decisions that shaped the galaxy were made. Today, one of those decisions would determine whether war or survival awaited the two factions. Stepping out onto the platform, Ethan and Zaria were met by a pair of council guards, their tall, armored figures silently escorting them toward the chambers where the Krallian and Eloxian leaders were already gathered. Cade stayed behind, his part of the mission done for now. He had delivered the information. They would have to do the rest. As they entered the Grand Council chamber, Ethan felt the tension immediately. The Krallian and Eloxian delegates sat on opposite sides of the room, each flanked by their military and political advisors. The hostility between them was palpable. No one spoke as Ethan and Zaria took their place in the center of the chamber. Commander Davis, the Eloxian delegate, the same multi-limbed figure from their previous meeting, said with a sharp edge to his voice, "You return with news, we hope." Ethan straightened, his face resolute. "I do. What we've uncovered is bigger than this conflict between your two peoples. There's an enemy lurking at your borders, and if you don't act together, neither of your factions will survive." Murmurs erupted from both sides of the room, but Ethan raised his voice to cut through the noise. "We've gathered evidence. Energy readings that show a fleet of unknown origin building in the contested regions. Outposts have been destroyed. Ships have vanished without a trace. This is no rogue faction. It's a threat beyond either of your military capabilities." Zaria activated a small device, projecting the holographic map that Cade had shown them. The data scrolled before the council, showing the destruction in grim detail. The Krallian delegate, the hulking reptilian figure from before, growled in disbelief. "You expect us to trust this human data? You think we are foolish enough to believe that the Eloxians haven't manufactured this to gain our trust?" "Enough," Zaria interjected, her voice calm but commanding. "This isn't about human or Eloxian lies. This data comes from neutral sources, people who have no allegiance to either of you. It's real, and you're both too blind with hatred to see the bigger picture." The Eloxian delegate hissed, leaning forward in his seat. "And what would you have us do, Zaria? You expect us to drop our weapons and join hands with the Krallians, as if centuries of bloodshed mean nothing." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. "No one's asking you to forget the past, but if you don't unite now, there won't be a future for either of your people. You've been so focused on your war that you've ignored the storm building right behind you." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Both sides stared at each other, distrustful and wary, but there was no denying the fear that had crept into their expressions. After what felt like an eternity, the Krallian leader spoke again, his voice a low rumble. "And what guarantee do we have that this enemy is even real? What proof do you offer beyond data and speculation?" Zaria exchanged a glance with Ethan, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. They had anticipated this question. Data wasn't enough for people so deeply entrenched in mistrust. "That's why," Zaria began, her tone carefully measured, "we need to provoke them." Eyes widened across the chamber. Ethan tensed, knowing the gamble she was proposing. "If we can draw them out," she continued, "give them a reason to strike, it will be undeniable. The threat will reveal itself, and when it does, you'll have no choice but to fight together." The room exploded in protest. Both the Krallians and Eloxians shouted in outrage, accusing Zaria of madness, of setting them up for disaster. Ethan stood firm, letting the storm rage, but his pulse quickened. Finally, Ethan raised his hands, calling for silence. "I know this sounds extreme, but the only way to prove that the threat is real is to show you. Zaria's right. We need to force their hand, but we won't do it recklessly. We'll choose a target, one we know they'll attack, and we'll be ready." The Krallian leader glared at him, his jaw clenched. "And what happens if they don't attack human? What happens if we expose our forces, only for nothing to happen? Then I'll take full responsibility, Ethan said, his voice resolute. But if we do nothing, we lose either way. The chamber fell into a heavy silence once again. The delegates exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. Finally, the Eloxian delegate spoke, his tone reluctant but grim. We will consider your proposal, but know this, human, if you are wrong, it will be your people who suffer the consequences. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. I understand. As they left the chamber, Zeria exhaled, her usual composure shaken. That was too close. It's not over yet, Ethan muttered, the tension coiling in his chest. Now we have to make sure they take the bait. The plan was set in motion faster than Ethan had anticipated. Both the Krallians and Eloxians were hesitant, but the growing evidence of the mysterious alien fleet, now combined with Cade's network-feeding intelligence of more disappearances, was too much for either side to ignore. Reluctantly, they agreed to a joint operation, though the trust between the two factions was paper-thin. Ethan, Zeria, and Cade worked tirelessly to plan the trap. They would set a decoy fleet, a small contingent from both the Krallian and Eloxian forces, in a contested region known for skirmishes between the two factions. It was an area where the enemy fleet had been spotted multiple times. The hope was to provoke a strike, one they could record, analyze, and present as undeniable proof of the external threat. As the preparations neared completion, the weight of the mission bore down on Ethan. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was their last chance. If the plan failed, it would not only doom the negotiations but likely lead to open war between the Krallians and Eloxians, with humanity stuck in the middle. In the command center, Ethan stood with Zeria, overseeing the final deployment of ships. The display before them showed the decoy fleet in position, a vulnerable target dangling in the blackness of space. Everything's set, Zeria said, her eyes scanning the holographic display. The trap's ready. Now we just wait. Ethan crossed his arms, his jaw tight, and hope. Zeria turned to him, her expression softening. I've been in worse situations, Commander. Trust me, we'll pull through. He appreciated her confidence, but Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in the back of his mind. This was a gamble, a dangerous one. They had risked everything on a theory, and if it didn't work. The silence was deafening as they waited. Minutes stretched into hours, each second agonizingly slow. The decoy fleet hung in space, vulnerable, while the true forces of both factions lay hidden just beyond sensor range, ready to spring into action at the first sign of attack. Then it happened. The alarm blared, and the display flared to life. Ships, dozens of them, emerged from the void, their sleek, black hulls shimmering as they dropped from faster-than-light speeds directly into the decoy fleet's path. Ethan's heart raced as the unknown vessels immediately began firing, their weapons tearing through the Krallian and Eloxian ships like paper. They're here, Zeria whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Ethan snapped into action. Send the signal. Activate the fleets. Within moments, the hidden Krallian and Eloxian forces surged forward, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they engaged the enemy. Explosions rocked the battlefield as the two factions fought side by side for the first time in centuries, united against a common foe. Ethan watched the battle unfold on the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The alien fleet was powerful, more powerful than even they had anticipated. But the combined strength of the Krallians and Eloxians held firm, pushing the enemy back inch by inch. Zeria was glued to the display, her sharp mind analyzing every move. They weren't expecting this level of resistance, she muttered. They're disorganized. That's our advantage, Ethan said, his voice tight. We can't let them regroup. For hours, the battle raged, each side taking heavy losses. But as the tide of the fight began to turn, the alien ships started to retreat, disappearing one by one into the darkness of space. The battlefield grew quiet, The only sounds the crackling of damaged ships and the hum of surviving engines. Ethan exhaled, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We did it." Zarya nodded, her eyes still scanning the aftermath of the battle. "For now. But this was just a scouting fleet. The real threat is still out there." He knew she was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the moment, they had won. They had proven that the enemy was real, and that both the Krallians and Eloxians needed to stand together to face the coming storm. The council chamber was silent as the final recording of the battle played before the gathered delegates. The footage was undeniable. The mysterious alien ships, the destruction they had wrought, and the unity between the Krallian and Eloxian forces as they fought side by side. The room was filled with a tense stillness as both factions absorbed the reality of what had just happened. Ethan and Zarya stood at the center of the room, waiting for the response. The evidence was overwhelming, but even now, the old wounds between the Krallians and Eloxians were deep. The Krallian leader, the hulking reptilian figure from before, was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, filled with a mix of grudging respect and lingering distrust. "You were right, human. The threat is real." The Eloxian delegate, the multi-limbed figure who had been their harshest critic, spoke next, his voice tight with tension. "We have no choice but to acknowledge that this enemy will destroy us all if we remain divided." Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've seen what happens when you work together. This was just the beginning. The next time the enemy strikes, they'll bring their full force. If you don't unite now, there won't be a next time." The two leaders exchanged a long, tense look. For a moment, Ethan feared that old hatreds would win out, that the fragile cooperation they had achieved would crumble in the face of centuries of bloodshed. But then slowly the Krallian leader extended one clawed hand toward the Eloxian delegate. The Eloxian hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached out, their hands meeting in a cautious but symbolic gesture of unity. The room erupted in murmurs, the tension slowly giving way to a cautious hope. It wasn't a full peace, far from it, but it was a start. As the council began discussing the next steps, plans for a joint military task force, strategies for dealing with the alien threat, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought these two warring factions together, however tenuously. Zarya stood beside him, a rare smile on her face. "I didn't think it was possible." Ethan chuckled softly, the tension finally easing. "Neither did I." As they turned to leave the chamber, Cade appeared at the doorway, his usual grin back in place. "Not bad for a couple of troublemakers. Ah." Ethan shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "We're not done yet." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you planning on saving the galaxy next?" Ethan glanced back at the council chamber, where the Krallians and Eloxians were still deep in discussion. "Maybe. One step at a time." Zarya nudged him playfully. "Let's just hope the next mission doesn't involve as much diplomacy." Ethan laughed, the sound light for the first time in days. "I'll take my chances." Together, the three of them walked out of the council building, into a future that was uncertain but filled with possibility. The war between the Krallians and Eloxians was over, and for the first time in centuries, there was a chance for peace. But more than that, there was a chance for something greater, a united front against the real enemy.